good afternoon, depending on where you are. I hope you're doing well and are healthy. And today we're going to talk about King Sargon II. King Sargon II is one of the most important Assyrian kings, largely because he has the largest body of correspondence of any of the Assyrian kings. There are thousands of archives, thousands of letters, correspondence belonging to this king and those who he communicated with, many, many more than other kings, including Ashur-bani-pal, who was his great-grandson. His grandson being Sarhaddon, and his son being Sennacherib. And we're going to be talking about his son Sennacherib and Sarhaddon, his grandson, and also his great-grandson Ashur-bani-pal in the next few sessions. Today I want to focus on Sargon II, or Sharrukin as he is known in ancient Assyrian. And we want to talk about a few of the issues that he had. Sargon was a very important king, not just for ancient Assyrians, but also for Assyrians in Chicago, because there's a street named after him, King Sargon Boulevard, which is Western Avenue, a certain section of Western Avenue. And I recall many years ago, many years ago, when this street was being named, I was interviewed by, I think it was NPR or one of the Chicago local branch of NPR, about the significance of King Sargon to the modern Assyrians. Why was it so important for them to have the name of this very ancient king, who the Assyrians had carried his name throughout the centuries? And even though it wasn't the original Akkadian name, nevertheless, the name Sargon survives. And one could say, and I heard a lot of people joking around, that the name Sargon is used for every other Assyrian. I myself have several cousins and an uncle named Sargon. So the name is very prevalent. It's also the name of middle name of my second son, Sharrukin, in that form, in the original form. It's also a name that is used for girls or women, Sharrukina, and so this name lives on among Assyrians in both its more biblical format, or Hebraic, or biblical terminology, Sargon, or in the ancient Assyrian term. So Sargon, as we said, is Sharrukin, which means Sharru means in ancient Assyrian, means king. Lugal in the original Sumerian, Sharru in the Akkadian or Assyrian, you could say, and Kina, which is a word that we use in the modern Assyrian. Kina is actually just. We also use the word Zadiqa, Melchizedek, which is another Assyrian term, more of an Aramaic term. So, not sure why I have a blank screen there. Not sure why that is. All right, let's begin with understanding the concept of king in ancient Assyria, because we're in a period right now where the Assyrian king is as absolute a monarch as you can get. King Sargon, and he is one could say, the patriarch of the Sargonid kings. They're known as the Sargonid kings, although we're going to find out today that it actually is not the starter of the dynasty of the Sargonid kings. That belongs to his father, Tiglath-Pileser III, who may be related to other royalty in the past, but there's some uncertainty to that. So the position of the king, especially in the Assyrian state, developed uh, during the Middle Assyrian period and then picks up during the Neo-Assyrian period, becomes a very central position. From being the priest of Ashur to being recognized as a supreme monarch of the Assyrian state and the Assyrian empire. And when Assyria becomes a world power, as in the time of Sargon II, Tiglath-Pileser III, his father, the Assyrians had had by now over 100 kings prior to the arrival of the Sargonid dynasty. And Assyria kept growing in terms of its power. And so its monarch had to be somebody who was of sound mind and body, in fact, a perfect specimen, according to ancient Assyrian literature. In a poem about the creation of mankind, the gods were thought to have fashioned the king in a special way, the Assyrian king, different from the rest of mankind. So there's this quote from a prayer. Ea, the god of wisdom, opened his mouth to speak, saying, Belet Ili, the goddess of creation, you are Belet Ili, the sister of the great gods. It was you who created man, the human. Fashion now the king, the human advisor. Shape the whole of his figure so pleasingly. Make perfect his countenance, and well-formed his body. And Belet Ili fashioned the king, the human advisor. So the human advisor, or the king for the Assyrians, was someone extremely important, extremely revered. Not everyone could come into his presence. Certainly by this time, he's become, as we said, an absolute monarch of the state and the empire. Now, the periods in Assyrian history that are important to know for this particular time is that we are in the Neo-Assyrian period. The territorial state of Assyria goes to imperial power from 934 to 745 BC. Recovery of areas lost after the Middle Assyrian period suffered setbacks, extension of control over areas further west, south, and east in the interest of both business and also political domination for security purposes during the reigns of Ashur-nasir-pal and Shalmaneser III, Ashur-nasir-pal II. There were internal problems in Assyria during the time of Shamshi-Adad, Adad-nirari, and 5 other kings. Imperial expansion and consolidation after 744, after the coming of Tiglath-Pileser III, the father of Sargon. Second expansion and further provincial organization during that time. Tiglath-Pileser III was an incredible king, reorganized the Assyrian Empire, came out of the slump, and his son, Shalmaneser V, was less than certainly capable than Tiglath-Pileser III. Nevertheless, he ruled for a short period of time. And then, of course, Sargon takes over, Sargon II, about whom we're going to focus our lesson today. And then his son, Sennacherib, his son, Sarhadun, and then his son, Ashurbanipal, and then 2 succeeding sons prior to the fall of the Assyrian Empire. But we'll get to that later. The downward spiral of the empire happens between 630 and 609 BC. And we have Ashur-itil-ilani, Sin-shar-ishkun, and Ashur-uballit II at the end of the reign of Imperial Assyria. The kings of the Neo-Assyrian period, including Sargon, viewed themselves as standing in the tradition of much older kings, particularly in the Middle Assyrian period, and viewed the expansion of their lands as recovering lost territories that had been lost to Assyria. So Mat Ashur was a priority for Assyrian kings, so expanding prosperity and order for the Assyrian kings involved both diplomatic, political, and, on the other hand, military efforts. And we are going to see that one of the ones who was most involved in reining in the troubles of the empire was the son of Tiglath-Pileser, Sargon II. For the Assyrians, the division between the early warrior kings of the Middle Assyrian period and the Neo-Assyrian period makes little sense, of course. However, the distinction between the merchant colony of Ashur, which was rather a small area geographically, and the imperial period has merit, especially after the arrival of Ashur-uballit I. Remember, the very first Assyrian king that used the term Sharru, or king, was Ashur-uballit I in the 14th century BC. So from the 14th century BC, we get to the 8th century BC during Sargon's time, and there have been many changes, and at this time, Sargon is reigning in the empire. But let's look at where he fits within the chronology of the Assyrian kings. We talk about Ashur-dan II as being really one of the first who carried out campaigns that expanded Assyrian territory from 934 BC until the reign of Shalmaneser III. Then we have a slight downward turn for the reign of several Assyrian kings until we get to Tiglath-Pileser III, and then his son, Shalmaneser V. And then, of course, we get to Sargon II. Now, the question is often asked, was Sargon a usurper? Was Sargon the first one to come to the throne? Did he cause the death of Shalmaneser V? The answer, most historians now say no. He was, in fact, the son of Tiglath-Pileser III, and he was the half-brother of Shalmaneser V, and of course the father of Sanchiru and Sefeddin and so on. Unprecedented growth of the Assyrian power. Was it iron? This is often asked by many Assyriologists. Iron became a major product after its use by Hittites and in the areas of Syria, Palestine. Assyrians used iron weapons. This, however, was not the reason for the advancement of military prowess of the Assyrians. The Assyrian military rather succeeded based on the advancement in other areas, use of advanced chariots with platforms, highly specialized siege warfare, use of battering ram, and so on, and reorganization of its military, as we will hear of Tiglath-Pileser and his son Sargon II. So Assyria expanded during the time of Ashur-dan, Adad-nirari, Tukulti-Ninurta, and other kings went north and west into the Levant, into Syria, and into Anatolia, and into what is Lebanon and southward, and then also east towards many of the areas of the Medes, as well as we will find out today about the Manneans, and then finally north into what was Urartu territory. So Ashur-nasir-pal II was one of the very important Assyrian kings, and he created a new capital city for the first time. Ashur-nasir-pal gets away from the aristocratic families of the upper classes of the Assyrians, who are in the city of Ashur, very wealthy families who owe their status to years of being involved in commerce. He creates a new capital in the city of Kalhu, or Nimrud, and although he was the second one to move the capital, Tukulti-Ninurta also created a city, but later kings after him actually went back to the city of Ashur. Ashur-nasir-pal's reign, Ashur-nasir-pal II's reign, caused the city of Kalhu, or Nimrud, to become a permanent capital of the empire until Sargon II changes that. And of course, tragically, as we said in the last lecture, the city was, destroyed largely by ISIS. This is only the surface of the area because the city is largely not fully dug up yet. But nevertheless, the Assyrian king Ashur-nasir-pal II created a new capital and a magnificent palace that was 200 meters long by 130 meters wide, something unseen in the ancient world, and created a new fort or fortress from which the army could prepare and depart to other places. Shalmaneser III was his son, and he also conquered territories, and according to one Assyriologist, created an Assyrian empire like no other. So what's happening here is, I hope you're understanding the pattern. We are building an empire. Each successive king that comes builds upon the gains of the others. So stands on the shoulders of his ancestors, if you will, and creates a greater area for rule, creates a more powerful and wealthier empire, creates more stability within the empire, and with that we have the growth of industries, various industries all over the empire. And we talked about that a bit last week, and I'll repeat a little bit of that this week. And by the way, of those of you who are interested in biblical history, the very first image that we have in ancient Near Eastern, actually the only portrayal of an Israelite king, is in this, what is called the black obelisk of Shalmaneser. And it is right here. The king bows before the Assyrian king. And this is a replica of this is at the Oriental Institute. You can go look at it, and it's there, and it is something to behold. Of course, what is here at the Oriental Institute is a replica in Chicago. Tiglath-Pileser, Tukulti Apel Ishara, is his original Assyrian name. The biblical name is Tiglath-Pileser. He's also known in the Bible as Pul, P-U-L. Sargon is the son of Tiglath-Pileser, who introduced the greatest expansion of the Assyrian Empire. Tiglath-Pileser transformed the personal guard into a standing army, the royal cohort that consisted of chariots and cavalry units, infantry and auxiliary infantry, light infantry. So king's personal bodyguards, personal guards are transformed into a standing army. Army is now capable of extended missions to incorporate new provinces into the empire, to balance power as the heads of provinces gain greater influence. And why is this? Because, by the way, welcome all of you. I'm letting you in as I'm seeing your names pop up. So welcome when you come in. And I'm going to just say this right now. When you are unable to attend, and if you are late, we will have a recording of these sessions, and we're going to upload them on YouTube at a later time. So when we have enough, you can kind of follow 1, 2, 3, 4, the classes that you missed. But I don't want you not to come to class, please. I really enjoy when you're here. The army was now capable of extended missions, and to balance the heads of provinces, they gained greater influence. The central power had to have permanent control. One of the things that Tiglath-Pileser also did is assign many eunuchs. What is a eunuch? A eunuch is a person who is castrated. The word that we use in modern Assyrians is chusya. One who is castrated because his family has devoted him as a child to the service of the king. And this was done among many of the royal families, many of the families that were close to power in the Assyrian kingdom. And we'll talk at a later time about the process of how one becomes a eunuch. But Tiglath-Pileser, and of course a eunuch cannot father children, cannot marry, cannot father children. His sole focus is devoted to the king. And this practice of having eunuchs, of course, extends into history, into even Ottoman history, many years after, long after the Assyrian Empire, and was a practice before the Assyrian Empire. But the Assyrians had a certain kind of culture around these figures whom they respected tremendously and considered them to be very intelligent and, of course, devoted. Allegiance of a large number of foreign troops was to the Assyrian king since they depended on him for their livelihood. So again, this is the centralization of Assyrian power. The Assyrian government is creating something like a federal government or the center of power, and the king's power is becoming more kind of a pyramid that is more sharply shaped with a military force that is able to kind of control the provinces which are becoming wealthier and more powerful. What Tiglath-Pileser III also did was consolidate power to the east of the Assyrian heartland, which is in northwestern Iran and central Iran, to the north in the Anatolian area, or in what is today modern Turkey. What is today modern Turkey, and then to the west of Assyria in the Levant, where there was a lot of wealth to be had. And the Assyrian Empire, as we discussed last time, was very interested in commerce. Tiglath-Pileser was one of the ones who was extremely interested in creating commerce. Tiglath-Pileser also conquers Urartu and reaches to Shaka, which is around Lake Van. Although his stay in Urartu was not as meaningful or as permanent as that of his son Sargon II, and we're going to talk about that. Queen Iaba was the wife of Tiglath-Pileser. Now, the Assyrian kings were always buried in the city of Ashur, which was the holy city for the Assyrians. It was, as I said many times before, the Vatican of the Assyrians. However, the queens were buried in other places. So certainly by this time, the capital of the Assyrian kingdom was Nimrud or Kalhu, and Yaba, the wife of Tiglath-Pileser III, was buried there. And here we have an inscription in her tomb, which was found in the 1980s by Iraqi archaeologists. And Assyrians had in their tombs many belongings, such as, I mean, if you could imagine for the queens, they would have this, what would they have had for the kings? For over 100 kings that were buried in the cemetery in Ashur. Of course, it's speculated by many archaeologists that many of the graves of the Assyrian kings had been robbed. And many of them, of course, also contained curses. Here for Queen Yaba, it says that by the command of Shamash and Anunnaki, the great gods of the netherworld, mortal destiny caught up with Queen Yaba in death, and she traveled the path of her ancestors, as we all will. Anyone in time to come, whether a queen who sits on the throne or a palace lady of the palace who is a favorite of the king, that removes me from my tomb or places anybody else with me or lays his hand on my jewelry with evil intent or breaks open the seal of this tomb on earth under the rays of the sun, let his spirit roam outside in thirst. In the netherworld, he must not receive with the Anunnaku any offering of libation, of water, beer, wine, or meal, but instead may Ningisada and the great gods of the netherworld inflict his corpse and ghost with eternal restlessness. So these are curses that Assyrian queens and Assyrian kings would have in their place of burial, because it was considered to be desecration of their infringement on their spirit and their travel in the other world, to be tampering with their belongings or their graves, as is said, with evil intent. And of course, I don't know if you know, but the archaeologists, the Iraqi archaeologists who found the graves of the queens and removed the jewelry that was there, including their bones, of course, he was asked, did anything happen to you? And he said, I became a diabetic after removing the jewelry from the Assyrian queens. Tiglath-Pileser and his son Shalmaneser V, as well as Sargon, were involved in many deportations. We talked about deportations. They were a feature of the Assyrian Empire. Part of what was being done was replace the skills from one area to another of Assyrians, as well as to punish rebelling populations. So in this case, we have the path of Israelites being taken out, Samaria, the kingdom of Samaria, and Israel, with deportations that were done by Tiglath-Pileser III, Shalmaneser V, and Sargon II in a continuous way. Sargon's ascension to power. According to Melville, who's an Assyriologist and the author of a book, The Campaigns of Sargon II, he was a chief architect of the Neo-Assyrian Empire who transformed a burgeoning power into the undisputed master of the Near East. Assyria was in times of enduring setbacks during the time of Ashur-dan III, and civil unrest continued to the time of Ashur-nirari V, who was overthrown by Tiglath-Pileser III, who is the father of Sargon, Sin-ah-ushur, and Ululaya. Ululaya is Shalmaneser V. Sin-ah-ushur also served as the chief charioteer or commander of the chariot forces with his brother Sargon II. His brother trusted him, and it was a very important position. And unlike in other cases where certain kings do not trust siblings because obviously there's a potential conflict there for to regain power, Sargon trusted his brother. Shalmaneser V was his half-brother, and Sargon says a number of things that Shalmaneser V had done wrong, but he also refers to his reign as being overthrown. However, scholars have interpreted this not as necessarily that the king was overthrown by himself, by Sargon II, who usurped his brother, but that somehow the god Ashur looked with disfavor upon his brother, his half-brother, and decided to remove him. And he actually, from all evidence, Shalmaneser V passes away and Sargon takes over. Some facts about Sargon. Of course, the name is Sharrukin, means the just king or the true king. Born in 726 to Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon married Raima and had 3 sons. 2 of them, one of the first 2 sons, and then Sennacherib, the first 2 sons actually passed away. He also had a daughter, Ahadabisha, married a second time to Atalia, who is buried in Kelhu. Half-brother was Shalmaneser V, as we said. Crown passed to Sargon after his brother's death. Has the most correspondence of any Assyrian kings, 1,200 tablets. And of course, there could have been scrolls in Aramaic as well. Sargon instructs and thank God he does this, one of his scribes that you've asked me, do you want me to write to you also in Akkadian? Why do you even ask this? You have to write in Akkadian and Aramaic when you write to me. You have to write in both languages. He built Dur Sharrukin, which is also known as Khorsabad, a city in North Iraq, which was thought to have been abandoned after his death, but there is no reliance, according to a number of archaeologists and a number of Assyriologists. We shouldn't rely heavily on the idea that once Sargon had passed, his entire city was abandoned. Certainly, it's a city that is brand new, so there was nothing on the site, unlike in Kelhu, which was built on a previous city. The city of Dur Sharrukin was a brand new city, and it was a spectacular city. And we're going to take a look at the art. Hopefully, we'll have time. Unlike many of the Assyrian kings, King Sargon II was killed in battle, and his body was never found. And this is one of the battles that his son undertakes against the kingdom of Tabal, which we will talk about next week when we discuss the reign of Sennacherib. But King Sargon was killed, in effect, because he was trying to solve some rebellions in that area, which is in Turkey, near the area of Anatolia. So his grave is, unlike the other Assyrian kings, his grave is not present in the city of Ashur. Now, during the reign of King Sargon, there were Assyrian magnates, and they've become very important, actually, from the time of his father. So they were vital to Assyria's political and military effectiveness, because although we often discuss the absolute rule of a monarch, that one person is in charge and he's handling everything and he should be blamed for everything. And of course, part of the reason we think this is because of the Assyrian archives. Also, the king takes a lot of the credit, but really the king is joined in a very organized administration, a very organized hierarchy by people such as the magnates, people who are in the elite class of Assyrian society. They balanced the Assyrian king's power, and oftentimes it was up to the king to direct them and to use their influence and their abilities and their brains and their energy towards whichever goal he was targeting. War and international relations played a role in forming a bond between Sargon and his elites, his magnates. Sargon's top officials benefited materially from war and were responsible for supplying materials to the Assyrian army and on campaigns. This should sound familiar to you because oftentimes elites profit from war, and we will see this again and again in the history of empires up to the empires that we are witnessing today. Members of the nobility formed part of the chariot forces and cavalry, and many generals were members of the upper echelons of power in Assyrian society. Sargon's army was organized in a new manner. Of course, it was built upon the organization of his father. Divisions of 5,000 to 10,000 men were organized under a particular leader, usually referred to as Rab, and then, of course, 5,000, Rab, Khamsha Alpe, Rab Alpa, and so on. Brigades of 1,000, battalions of 500, companies of 1 to 200 men headed by Rab Immiyat, or Rab Imma, platoons of 50 men led by what is called in ancient Assyrian as Rab Khamshi, or Rab Khamshi or Khanshi. Now, these terms, Rab Imma, Rab Trimma, and so on, are terms that were used in modern Assyrian forces who served with the British. So this rank was actually used during the 1920s among the Assyrian levies as well. Yet another form of continuity among the Assyrians. Royal bodyguards were Shah Urartu, Qurba, close by, forces that were close by to the king, meaning near the king. Royal cavalry guards, Bet Khal Urartu, 1,000 strong, were headed by Sargon's brother, as we said, Sin'ah Ushur. The cavalry during Sargon's time took an increased role, in part because of this campaign in the mountains. The cavalry became very important, more important than actually the chariot forces, because chariot forces could not travel in territory that is mountainous. So Sargon increased the use of cavalry, and this helped with the mobility of the military. Acquisition and care for horses and mules was a priority. Cushite horses, for example, came from Egypt. They were used for chariots. They were larger, hardier horses, and smaller horses from the Zagros Mountains, from the Medes, were used for the cavalry. They were faster. Recruitment officers oversaw the process and made sure horses were properly cared for, and there's a whole obsession with making sure that horses are taken care of properly to be used. Remember, this is a very important form of mobility for the Assyrian military. Others were stable overseers and were charged of equestrian units on campaign. Larger herds were kept on estates in Assyria for emergencies. And this is an example of the palace instruction for war. So when you had to get together, the king was pretty serious about getting your military together so that you could engage in warfare. So here we have a letter from Sargon to one of his commanders. Get together your officers plus the horses of your cavalry contingents immediately. Whoever is late will be impaled. So Sargon apparently never tolerated people that were late. Whoever is late will be impaled in the middle of his own house. If that's not frightening, I don't know what is. And whoever changes perhaps the course of the city will also be impaled in the middle of his house, and his sons and daughters will be slaughtered by his order. Do not hold back. Leave your work. Come right away. Obviously, this is an urgent situation. This is not the type of order that Sargon would regularly give. Sargon's character comes out in his Urartu campaign, which we will go over, and where he expresses a deep concern for his forces. He cares about his men, and at one point I will read to you. All right, so somebody sent me. Please don't impale me in the middle of your house. I'm sorry about that. I will not impale you. This is only King Sargon talking from a very long time ago. And then, of course, the response to typically the response to the king's call was, I will assign my king's men, chariots, and cavalry as the king wrote to me, and I will be in my lord's presence, in the king, my lord's presence, in Arbela with my king's men and troops by the deadline that the king, my lord, set. So here we have a system, a hierarchical system of military commanders that the king needed to make his armies effective. And of course, the horse played a very important role in the mobility of the Assyrian military as they moved, in particular, the cavalry as they moved, in particular, into the mountainous terrains. But things weren't always smooth for Sargon or for any other Assyrian king, and we have some interesting comments, interesting letters from the time of King Sargon II, and we have one from the governor an Assyrian governor in the Zagros area, today's Iran, who complains that last year the cell of Bel Edina did not go with me on campaign, but kept the men at home and sent with me young boys only. Now may the king send me a deportation officer and make him come forth and go with me. Deportation officer is one who enforces the rules. Otherwise, he will again rebel, fall sick, shirk, and not go with me, but will send only little boys and hold back the best men. So we have somebody complaining here to the king, and this person, who is the governor, is asking the king to intervene because he is unable to have his order carried through. So if the king commands, then things will be different. So another from the king's governor, he's talking about one officer who comes into his village, and he says, he went into one of my villages, opened the silo, and piled up grain meaning he took the quantity for X healthy men. I went and spoke to him, saying, why did you do this by yourself without deputy? Open the king's granaries. What does that tell you? That tells you that the Assyrians had a certain kind of order, that people had to follow commands. So, and then he says, he would not look me in the eye, but said, quote, "In the month of Nisan, my fodder supply fell, and the horses are collapsing before me. I cannot manage." So he's seeking help. So there's a little bit of sympathy here from the governor, and he's explaining to the king that although he's violated the rule, there should be mercy because this man cannot manage, and his horses were collapsing. Another comes from a Nabu Belu Ka'ain. "We are clearing the road, but snow is filling them up. There is much snow. The year before last, there was snow like this. The rivers were frozen, and the men and horses with me died in the snow." So you can imagine these Assyrian forces have penetrated very mountainous territory that is very cold, and this is a warning to the king that the difficulty in going into these areas during the cold obviously will cause much hardship and death. And a complaint, and of course there's a passage from Sargon himself. He says, "And there was much snow, and I had to turn back," in a certain campaign. A complaint from an officer about troops who are, quote, "loitering in the center of Kala with their mounts," this is Nimrod, "with their mounts like common thugs and drunkards." So this is a passage blaming these soldiers who are behaving like thugs and drunkards. And of course, this was something. Why would you complain? Because it's obviously unacceptable, and it was a complaint that went up the ladder to the commanders of Sargon because troops were supposed to behave themselves. So some of Sargon's challenges when he came to power was that Babylon was being taken over by a usurper, Marduk-Baladan II, and we're going to talk about that. Syria needed to be paid attention to, the area of Syria or the Levant, Syria and Palestine, Lebanon, and Urartu and Phrygia. And Urartu in particular was becoming a power again, although Tiglath-Pileser had engaged. The Urartians had reached the heart of their territory. They were nevertheless still regaining some power and challenging the Assyrian states by getting involved in the smaller states that were around the Assyrian heartland, in particular in the northeast, around the area of Lake Urmia and to the east of that. Now, first of all, Marduk-Apla-Iddina, or Marduk-Baladan, the second of the Bidyakan, takes power in Babylon. This was a man who had engaged with Tiglath-Pileser, had made peace with the father of Sargon. He was a chief of the Bidyakan tribe in southern Mesopotamia. Sargon's descriptions portray Marduk-Baladan as a usurper who oppressed Babylonia and relied on Elamite military power for his own power and for his rebellion. He overthrows the Assyrian administration in Babylon and declared himself a king. Now, oftentimes we see in various writings a simplified version of what's going on between Assyria and its cities, such as Babylon and other cities, Uruk, for example, and other cities. This was not a situation where the Babylonians were seeking independence. I want to really tell you that the sources do not show that there was a nationalistic kind of effort on the part of Babylonians against the Assyrians. What's happening here is that this person, Marduk-Baladan, is not really a native of Babylon. He has taken Babylon, and he has broken a treaty with the father of Sargon. And breaking a treaty with the Assyrian kings meant that everything was off the table. So treaties were supposed to be followed. Oaths, as we said last week, Mamitu or Momita, was supposed to be followed among Assyrian kings. So it was extremely valuable. You held respect in the ancient world by adhering to treaties. And when you broke them, you became a sort of uncivilized person, a person on the periphery of society. So he obtained This person, Marduk-Baladan, obtained assistance from Elam. Sargon takes the road to Dur in central Mesopotamia and battles both Elamites and the armies of Marduk-Baladan, or Babylonians. Some scholars state that the battle is indecisive. However, Sargon returns to rule Babylon, is actually invited to come to Babylon. This Chaldean chief flees the area. Now he causes more trouble in the future for Sargon's son, Sennacherib, but at this time, Babylon is free, and actually Sargon lives in Babylon for at least 3 years. And many in Assyria think that he should not have gone there because his capital was Nimrud, or Telhu. Now, I want to just say one thing about, because there's always confusion about this term Chaldean during this time. The word Chaldean, as scholars have shown, was really not used, okay, for either Neo-Babylonian or Babylonian times. It was not an ethnic designation. It was never actually used by these people who call themselves Dityakan or Dakuri or Amukani. We talked about this in the earlier classes, but I just want to emphasize to you, according to scholars who are looking at archaeological evidence, looking at textual evidence, not only do we find no ancient claim for the Chaldean origin of the dynasty of Marduk-Baladan and others, but the term Chaldean does not appear even once in late Babylonian cuneiform documentation. So Sargon took care of the Babylonian issue. He handled, when we're talking about Babylon, of course, I refer to this term sometimes, Babylonia, but this term does not exist in Akkadian. Babylonia is a later invention by Greeks and Romans. It is not used, and maybe later in Hebrew as well, but it's not a term used in Akkadian. It is not a native term, is what I'm saying. And so the term often for this area is Ekkad. And Somar and Ekkad. Somar is the southernmost area of Mesopotamia. Babylonia, or Ekkad, is the kind of central area of the southern area of Mesopotamia, or the southern, northernmost southern area of Mesopotamia, or I guess you could say center of Mesopotamia. Ilu Bi'adi of Qarqar, according to Sargon, killed the citizens of Assyria. Now, Ilu Bi'adi was a Qarqar, may have been an Israelite who had a treaty with Assyria, and so he violates it while the trouble in Babylon is going on. Sargon marches into Syria and the Levant. He confronts his enemies and defeats them, all of Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, the entire area. The march is 1,650 from Kalhu all the way to Sinai. The Assyrian army, quote, inflicted on them a major defeat, blocked the river with their corpses, burned their cities, turning them into ashes. They established a devastation in the land of Hama. Of course, this is Hama in today's Syria. Ilu Bi'adi was captured and taken to Ashur and flayed publicly after Sargon returned victorious. Egyptian power in this area, which was fomenting revolution and rebellion, is pushed back. And here we have an image of Ilu Bi'adi, or Yahu Bihdi, also known in ancient times, punished for the rebellion and for killing of Assyrians. Now, one of the goals of Tiglath-Pileser III, the father of Sargon, and his son Shalmaneser V, who reigned less than Tiglath-Pileser did, certainly less than Sargon also, and was less capable. But one of their goals was to pacify the areas around Assyria so that there would be no security threat to the heartland of Assyria and its cities. Another was, of course, to protect the trade routes and to keep the profits coming to the heartland, as well as to benefit the provinces, which were ruled by Assyrian magnates. Sargon and Rusa of Urartu are in conflict over commercial power of the north and east to Assyria. These are rich areas. They supply horses, they supply grains, they supply all types of manufactured goods. And the Assyrians are very interested in, of course, acquiring the upper hand in this trade. Conflict first centers around the manipulation of smaller states between Assyria and Urartu, such as Mannea, south of Lake Urmia, and in what is today Azerbaijan, part of Iran, and also to the east of Lake Urmia. And Sargon takes Mannea south of Lake Urmia and destroys the holy site of Haldi, which is very important to the Urartians. In 714 BC, war with Urartu erupts on Mount Waush, east of Lake Urmia. Now, to understand Urartu, Urartu is a kingdom that was becoming very powerful, had dominated the area of what is northeastern Turkey and southeastern Turkey, including the Hakkari area, or the Hakkari area, very difficult to control because of its mountainous areas. But nevertheless, it is thought that the Urartians had controlled this area. And as far as the Manneans are concerned, who are in this area around Lake Urmia, they are related somewhat to the Urartians, and they are closer linguistically and ethnically. They are part of the Hurrian, similar to Hurrian people, similar to Mitanni, but they are different than Urartu. And one of the issues that was involved with between the Assyrians and the Urartians was Mannea. And of course, there were wars before, going back in time. Assyrians had penetrated these areas that were controlled by Urartians, but they were never quite able to control the drive of Urarti in controlling smaller states. So allied to them, Musasir, Mannea, and other places here were often allied with the Urartians, partly because of intimidation, partly because of wealth, and the Assyrians needed to quell any kind of rebellion and obtain these people as allies. So there was competition for kind of smaller states, very similar to what we see today in the world. Power politics between regional and international powers. The Mannean kingdom began to flourish around Lake Urmia, as we said, around 850 BC. They were a settled people. The capital was Urartu, which is located right here. By 820 BC, they had expanded and become the first large state to occupy the region since the Gutians, which were earlier people, later followed by unrelated Iranian peoples, including the Medes and the Persians, who took over this area. They had a prominent aristocracy and a ruling class, which somehow limited the power of their kings. But beginning in the 800 BC, region became contested between Urartu, built several forts on the territory of Mannea and Syria. During the open conflict between the two, 750 to 730, Mannea seized the opportunity to enlarge its holdings, and they were using the Assyrians and the Urartians for benefit for themselves. And then we have, of course, King Sargon moving into Mannea in effect because Urartu was causing so much trouble. And so the allies of the Urartians, according to Sargon here, which he names them the people of the land of Kakumi, the evil enemy from inside his land, to repulse Ursa or Rusa, who is the king of the Urartians, in open battle, to turn the scattered Manneans because they were being persecuted, according to Sargon, by the Urartians, to stand in might over his enemy, to do what he wants. That man, meaning the Mannean, together with his nobles, the governor of his land, entreated me, crawling before me on their four limbs like dogs. I took pity on them. I paid attention to their prayers. I heard their words of entreaty and spoke to them truly. Now, part of what Sargon's doing here is engaging in, of course, propaganda. The other part is, of course, he's also rescuing a people, according to him, and we'll see more references to this, from an enemy that is persecuting them, which is the Urartu. And of course, we have this long passage in his letter to Ashur, where Sargon tells a story. I'm not going to read all of this. Tells a story of how he passes through this territory of the Manneans, where he sits down and eats with them. These people, with the people of Assyria, I caused to sit down at a joyous table before Ashur and the gods of their land, the gods of their land. Now, this is always very important to remember. The Assyrians never forced their God, their religion on other people. They allowed other people to worship their gods, and they respected other people's gods as well. So, and the gods of their land, they blessed my majesty, and he names a number of people here who come from very far away, and Medes also, and they pay tribute to King Sargon. And he also talks about, of course, how terror afflicted them because they heard of Sargon coming to this area. We have various descriptions by King Sargon where he's talking about these incredible mountains, and his passages are very fascinating when he talks about these incredible mountains that, and here's a passage here, come to a mountain, peak of which stands up like a blade of a dagger. These mountains are incredible mountains in the area of north area of Urmia, the Hakkadi area, and so on. He's penetrating north into areas which belong to the Urartians. And he says, I, Sargon, king of the four regions of the world, ruler, shepherd of Assyria, guardian of Ben Marduk, who carefully observes the law of Shamash, of the seed of Ashur, the city of learning, quick of wit, and so on. And he is from the seed of Ashur, and he prays to Ashur. He lifts up his hands that Ashur might bring about the defeat of the Urartian king, and he wants to turn his insolent words against himself and make him bear his sin. And he says very clearly that this is a battle passage that Sargon inflicts on the Urartians, and eventually they escape. I'm going to share this with you, by the way, in the email. Him I shut up in his crowded camp and cut down, decimated from under him his draft horses and arrow javelin. To save his life, he abandoned his chariot, mounted a mare, and fled before his army. This is like the Persian king fleeing before Alexander the Great when Alexander takes over Persia, Achaemenid Persia. So he cuts down their army, and in the heart of my terrible weapons, I went up after them. In the heat of my terrible weapons, I went up after them, filling the ascents and descents with the corpses of their warriors. And Sargon, of course, conquers the Urartian area. Urartu is no more a powerful kingdom that can challenge Assyria. Assyria meets with other challenges, and unfortunately, Sargon going on another campaign, and you'll notice that Sargon is one of the most adventurous of Assyrian kings. Unfortunately, Sargon dies and in battle, and his body is not found. He is fighting near Phrygia. King Midas, he's very happy at one point that King Midas extends an olive branch to the Assyrians, and the Assyrians unfortunately are unable to quell the problems in those areas. In the area of Tabal, which is a former vassal of the Assyrian Empire, rebellion is stopped only after Sargon's death. Sargon's legacy remains. Sargon's stamp, or his stele, is also in Cyprus. So Assyrians conducted an expedition and dominated Cyprus. As we talked last time, the Assyrians were heavily involved in Phoenician trade and traveled with Phoenicians, actually being in charge of the trade, and probably reached all areas of Europe, although evidence hasn't been found. But certainly on the island of Cyprus, there is the stele of King Sargon. King Sargon's second wife, Atalia, Queen of Sargon, King of Assyria, is the one that has marked her some of her wares, as we said, with the Queen of Queen Yava of Tiglath-Pileser III, the father of King Sargon. She also had her jewelry, and she also had her curses, and left behind an incredible legacy of wealth and skill. Assyrian skill during this time was incredible. There is nothing like the treasures of Nimrud today. The empire that Sargon left was like no other. It had an incredible system of archives and information retrieval and communication system, intricate, refined system of intelligence gathering and dissemination, the development of an international economic system. The palace sector was very important, the government sector, and the private sector. And also, I'm going to touch in a number of coming lectures on also another sector, the religious sector, the priestly sector, which becomes very important for understanding the continuity of the Assyrian people. So also the creation of an imperial ideology among Assyrians based on the Assyrian state religion. And then we have a little bit of a separation of the priestly class from the monarchical class in Assyria. And when we see that Assyria falls, the monarchy no longer survives, but the priestly class survives. And then eventually we have the conversion to Christianity many centuries later. First conversions also to Zoroastrianism, in part to Judaism, and then to Christianity. So the Assyrian Empire is going to keep growing. And during the Neo-Assyrian period, the son of Sargon II and the grandchild of Sargon II and his great-grandson are going to expand the Assyrian Empire to create an empire that history has never seen. It is extremely sophisticated, and it forms the very basis of empires that came later. Now, Sargon's architectural wonder, Dur Sharrukin, is something to behold, and I'm going to kind of quickly, because we're past our time, skim through these photographs that you see. This is a recreation of what Assyrian sculptures looked like, and you have this particular Assyrian winged bull at the Oriental Institute. This is Sargon's prism commemorating the founding of Dur Sharrukin, the new town. The great winged bull and some of the reliefs are at the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago. You can visit them today, which is, those of you living in Chicago are very lucky. Here's the great winged bull in the Oriental Institute, and that is fits right here with where the palace is. And of course, in ancient times, these sculptures were all colored. So you can imagine them in different colors. The scale of the Assyrian reliefs during Sargon's time are incredible. They are not ordinary in the sense that the size is not the same as other kings. Obviously, there was no more space to work with, but the artist who created these, and you can see these in the Oriental Institute, was truly an incredible artist. The finesse with which he created these, and of course the winged bull, is something to behold.